Chang will be reading the Q&A. And we will hit record now. Welcome everyone to our last roundtable of the Toward Transformative Justice hosted by the Northwestern Prison Education Program, NPEP. NPEP is a Northwestern University initiative that provides a high quality liberal arts education to incarcerated students in Illinois. We had 5 amazing and diverse panels, all dealing with policing and racism, and I am sure this our last 6th session will be incredible too. At NPEP, we felt this discussion of racism and policing comes at an important and crucial time for the Northwestern community. Before my colleague Arturo Chang introduces our speakers, I wanted to remind all of us that our students are incarcerated individuals who do not have the privilege to join us today. So I want to have that in mind during our whole roundtable. And I really hope in the near future we can have their voices join us. I will now turn it over to Arturo Chang to introduce our amazing speakers.
Thanks, Ali. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today again for our last roundtable. I'll introduce our first speaker. Traci Burch is an associate professor of political science at Northwestern University and a research professor with the American Bar Foundation. She has numerous publications on race, American politics, and political participation, including her 2 books titled Trading Democracy for Justice and co-authorship for Creating a New Racial Order. Traci brings expertise today in political participation and race, and thanks so much for joining us today, Traci.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Arturo, and also for this opportunity to speak with you and your group today. It's been, can you all hear me? Okay, good. So it's, I was asked to kind of give you an overview of some of the, just to get us all on the same page with respect to the criminal justice system and mass incarceration and some ways that it can affect politics and voting. And I just wanted to start with this, I guess the same statistics that most people do, but again, just to get us all on the same page. So there are about 2.2 million people in prison or in jail here in the United States. And the National Research Council, the imprisonment has increased dramatically since they began keeping statistics in 1925. And a lot of that explosion started to happen in the 1970s. The National Research Council estimates that about half of the state prison population growth, where most people are incarcerated, since 1980 has been due to an increase in the time that people have been serving in prison, including, for instance, there are about 150,000 people who are serving life sentences here in the US. What's been interesting, I guess, throughout the course of my career is that one of the things I thought was impossible when I came into this field started to happen in the sense that prison populations did start to decline beginning after 2006 in most states. In 6 states, that decline was almost about 20% since off of the peak, but some states have, a few states have also increased their populations over time. As with respect to the topic of this panel, there's a racial impact that most of us are aware of with respect to incarceration. So the lifetime likelihood of going to prison varies by race. For men, it's about 1 in 9 overall for all men, but among white men, about 1 in 17 white men are expected to serve time in prison in their lifetime, compared with 1 in 6 Latino men and 1 in 3 Black men. For women, women are less likely to serve time in prison anyway, but even then you see a racial disparity among this group as well. So for women, about 1 in 111 white women are expected to serve time in prison, compared with 1 in 18 Black women and 1 in 45 Latino women. So those disparities are quite high. At least for men, it's more than Black men are more than 5 times as likely as white men to serve time in prison. And for women, it's almost 6 times as likely for Black women. So federal prison is mostly because the federal government does different things. Mostly people are in for drug offenses, but that has changed dramatically since the 90s. And now public order offenses, which includes weapons and immigration offenses, have taken over in terms of why people are serving time in federal prison. I'd also like to note here that probation and parole are other forms of punishment that people may be serving time for misdemeanors and felonies. And about 4.5 million people are on probation or parole here in the United States. So just to talk about politics and electoral politics, especially, and how we might think about the intersection between the criminal justice system and politics. Most people, I think about felony disenfranchisement laws when they think about the intersection between politics and criminal justice. And that's an obvious reason, because the Sentencing Project estimates about 6.1 million people couldn't vote in the 2016 presidential election because of their felony conviction. A lot of that is due to the people who are incarcerated or disenfranchised while they're serving sentences, but also post-release. So only 2 states in the country have no restrictions on people voting because of a felony conviction, and that's Maine and Vermont. 14 states, all the other states, people in prison can't vote. In 14 states, that's the only group that is disenfranchised. An additional 4, such as California, Connecticut, New York. I can't remember the other state. Also, disenfranchised people who are on parole as well, so prison and parole. So that's 18 total. Again, 14 just prison. An additional 4 also do parole. There are, I think there are additional states that take people who are also on probation can't vote. So even if you're serving time in the community, that's an additional 18 states that prevent all current people serving felony sentences. All felony sentences can't vote. And there are 12 states that also have some restriction on people even after they finish serving their sentences. And that is where you can really get big numbers in terms of disenfranchisement rates. So there's been some movement on this policy over time. So many states have moved in more in a direction to allow people to vote more. So Delaware, for instance, in the last decade, decreased their 5-year waiting period to get. They eliminated the 5-year waiting period after sentencing, after a sentence was complete. Alabama even eased the restoration process in 2016. California re-enfranchised people who were in jail. Maryland and Rhode Island and a few other states re-enfranchised community supervision, people who were serving sentences under community supervision. Some states have been going back and forth. So sometimes governors would make a move to re-enfranchise people. So usually a Democratic governor, sometimes a Republican governor. So in Virginia, for instance, the governor, Terry McAuliffe, at the time, re-enfranchised people who had finished serving their sentences. The Virginia Supreme Court overturned that. In Iowa, it was governors. So a Democratic governor in 2005 re-enfranchised people, and then a Republican, I believe, then disenfranchised them. And then I think that the most recent governor may have done something else to allow people to vote. So So these rights have been, the right to vote has been extended and also rescinded in some other places. It's been unstable, and in several states. Some of the other issues that I talk about in my work include the other barriers that people face in general as a result of a felony conviction. As a political scientist, we all know that participation in politics depends on several factors. To make it short, Burbage, Schlossman, and Brady say that people tend to participate in politics because they can, meaning they have the resources such as time, money, and civic skills to do so. They want to, and that's kind of an attitudinal component like efficacy and engagement and interest, or they get asked. So there's mobilization and other, and by interest groups, by parties, by other people and friends. And incarceration and its aftermath can shape all of those three clusters of factors. So obviously with respect to resources, the harder it is for people to be reintegrated into the economy after they exit prison, for instance. It's much harder to vote. Residential stability, for instance, is kind of a prerequisite for registering, or at least to do so in a way that is stable and easy. Likewise, being able to be contacted and mobilized by parties sometimes relies on a stable address, because they often reach out to people who voted before and they send mailers to the address, your registration address, and social networks. So if, to the extent that people are isolated or not able to maintain contacts with friends and family, or make new contacts through jobs and the like, it's a lot harder to mobilize people into politics. And finally, there's the attitudinal component. Again, it could be that the experience of police, courts, and the criminal justice system could turn off individuals and make them less likely to participate and to feel part of the polity and engaged as citizens. And so, apart from the legal barriers of disenfranchisement, you may also have other barriers that are a direct result of the conviction that may also tend to stop people from participating in politics. And finally, I want to make a note of a really important factor that I think most people don't think about, but is always kind of front and center in my mind as I think about this issue. And that is the effect on people, not just because of incarceration, but also because of probation. One of the things that I think is really interesting, especially given the mass demonstrations that have been taking place here in the United States, is that when we think about protests, one of the connections we often don't make is that to protest is inherently a dangerous act, especially if you are encountering police. And for people who are on probation or parole, rearrest is a particular danger of certain kinds of political activities, such as protests. So, to the extent that you might think of even rearrest or probation violations as a barrier to being able to engage in all forms of politics. That's another idea that I want to flag for you, that it's not just voting as the only form of politics that's affected by legal barriers. Protest can be affected as well. So with that, I'll stop, because I'm not sure how much time I've gone, and leave it to the other panel.
Thanks, Traci. Okay, great. And so now we will move on to our second speaker. Daryl Atkinson is co-director at Forward Justice, a nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to advancing racial, social, and economic justice in the U.S. South. As co-director, Daryl has participated, led, and contributed to numerous community efforts for racial justice. Today, he brings expertise in organizing, advocacy strategy, and legal reform at local, state, and federal levels. Thanks so much for joining us today, Daryl.
Yeah, thank you, Arturo, and I want to thank Dr. Burch for facilitating my participation and for also really contributing to some significant movement work that we're trying to advance and forward justice. But before I begin into the meat and the merits of my presentation, just a little bit of background on forward justice and our theory of change, right? We have kind of three intertwined or interlocking theories of change. One, we believe that both was prophetic. As the South goes, so goes the nation. You win the South, you win the country. Two, social movements is what create change, not issues, not one single individual, not a single organization, a social movement for change. And the moral center of those social movements are directly impacted people. So whatever that movement is, right, whether you're talking about civil rights movement, the Me Too movement, the undocumented movement, it's the people who are under the boot of that particular oppression who are going to be the moral center of that movement, right? And some of our most potent social movements in this country have been rooted in the South. We use three principal strategies to effectuate change at our organization. We try to change law, policy, and practice in a way that builds power for our people. We want to change narrative, culture, and values. It isn't just the legal machinations, right? When I was part of the Obama administration, Valerie Jarrett used to often quote that you change culture, change each strategy for breakfast. You change culture, values, law, policy, and practice is going to be so much more malleable to change. And then lastly, you have to have a base of people that you have built, leaders, to protect and sustain and gain new wins. And so that's how we try to engage in this work. And we believe very much that we are working with our movement partners to usher in the third Reconstruction. And so what does that mean, right? It may seem like some amorphous kind of concept, but I would use our first and second Reconstructions as instructive of what I'm getting at here. So first Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, you had the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You had the birth of public education. You had the election of over 1,500 directly impacted people to all levels of government across the South and in the Jim Crow South, as well as the birth of economic infrastructure like Black Wall Street that was in Durham, North Carolina. Second Reconstruction, 1959 to 1971, you had the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, birth of affirmative action, things to try to address the remedial harm of 99 years of apartheid, right? So we're trying to usher in the third. So it's going to take some durable legal changes, but also the institution building that also occurred out of those prior reconstructions as well. But I want to talk about one of the durable legal changes that I see consistent both in the first, second, and what our case that I'm going to talk specifically about in the third is what I call expanding the we. Right? Our biggest fights in this country has been about who's included in that we and we the people, right? So at one point, only white male property owners were included in that we, and then we were able to expand it a little bit for Black males, and let's not even talk about the patriarchy embedded in that, and then women, and then we're fighting now when we talk about re-enfranchisement of people who might have committed felonies. We're talking about another expansion of the we, in my estimation. And that's what our case was about in North Carolina that, I had the pleasure of working with Dr. Burch on, and we brought constitutional claims that our current felon disenfranchisement law, which disenfranchises over 56,000 people living in North Carolina communities who might be on probation and parole. And that's not even including the folks with out-of-state convictions, but 56,000 is the best estimate that we can get we know there are 51,441 North Carolinians on state supervision. On any given day, there's about a 5,000 population snapshot of people who are living in North Carolina who've been convicted or who are under federal supervision. We don't even know the numbers for folks who are living in North Carolina who have out-of-state convictions. Our statute reads, it requires for you to get the restoration of your voting rights, for you to get what's called an unconditional discharge from probation and parole. And very often that requires the payment of legal financial obligations. And that if you don't pay, it can result in an extension of your probation, thereby an extension of your disenfranchisement. So we brought four different constitutional claims, state-based equal protection claim, Article 1, Section 19. We also brought a free elections clause claim. We brought a property qualifications claim, and we brought a freedom of associations claim that in the way that they were violating people's core political speech. And I just want to, after 1,000 pages of depositions and briefing and discovery, I just want to list out for you all some of the unrebutted facts. And at a motion for summary judgment hearing, the way, if there's no genuine issue of material fact, these things are true in the record. And so this is what the other side, after all of that briefing and work, did not rebut. And I just want to go through some of this. And if I look off a little bit on the screen, it's that I'm looking at my other monitor. I'm still paying attention to you all. So history of racist intent. We had three different experts in addition. Well, we had three experts, including Dr. Burch. We had a historian. We had two political scientists who were looking at two different sets of issues. And so our historian, our expert witness, Dr. Burden, submitted evidence that in the 1860s, North Carolina disenfranchised only people who were committed of infamous crimes, not all felonies. However, immediately after the Civil War, rebels engaged in a widespread campaign of convicting African Americans of infamous crimes by whipping them into punishment. You could whip them into infamy. In fact, we put in the evidence Harper's Weekly article that talked about, is quoted every day during about a month while the state court was recently sitting at Raleigh. There was a crowd of nearly 500 people outside the courthouse witnessing the public whipping of colored men as fast as they were convicted and sentenced to be whipped by the court. The sentence of whipping operates in North Carolina as a civil disqualification, so that none of these victims, according to local law, could ever vote. Even if suffrage were extended to colored men, they are disqualified in advance. In 1877, that's the first time that disenfranchisement shows up in the North Carolina Constitution. What is 1877? That's on the heels of radical Reconstruction. And our expert witness, historian Dr. Burden, put into the record that it was intentionally done to dilute the political power, the newfound political power of re-enfranchised African Americans and fusion politics that they had engaged in with poor whites. It was particularly to neuter all of the advancements of the 15th Amendment. The Democrat, John Henderson, who chaired the bill, was a known Jim Crow segregationist, and he presided over the lynching of 3 men. They were lynched across the street from his home. There were noteworthy aspects of the 1877 implementing legislation that still remain in practice today. Current legislation applies to all felonies, just like the 1877 legislation. In 1877, they made it a crime for a person with a felony conviction to vote before their rights were restored. Right now, it's a crime to vote before your rights are restored. And in 1877, the punishment was 2 years. Right now, the punishment is 24 months. There's no difference. And last electoral cycle in 2016, in fact, 12 people were prosecuted out of Alamance County, and they became known as the Alamance 12. The statutory scheme required people to wait 4 years from the date of conviction in 1877. We still have prolonged periods of disenfranchisement right now in 2020, right? The average term of probation is 30 months. And remember, you are disenfranchised while you're on probation and parole in North Carolina. Current racial disparities that we put into the record. Amici, Sentencing Project, put it in the record that Blacks are disproportionately impacted at the criminal legal system at various points. More specifically, Amici found that Black men are more likely to be stopped by the police, searched by the police, shot by the police, arrested by the police, charged by prosecutors with more severe crimes prior to trial, receive higher bail amounts, have lower diversion rates, and receive harsher sentences. More specifically, we specifically cited to North Carolina data, where under policing context, expert witness Frank Baumgartner had analyzed 20 million traffic stops. We have a racial profiling act in North Carolina. We've been collecting that data since 1999. African Americans are 2 times more likely to be searched and to be stopped and then searched incident to a stop, even though contraband hit rates are higher for whites, meaning you're more likely to find the dope and the guns on white folks, but Black folks are searched at 2 times to the level that white people are. Blacks in 2018 were 3.3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana. Prosecution and pretrial release. Prosecutors, according to a Wake Forest law professor, were more likely to strike Black jurors, 2 times more likely to strike Black jurors than whites. And racial disparities were also prevalent in pretrial release, where African Americans were 3.2 times more likely to be in jail and 4.3 times more likely to be in prison. And this is all North Carolina data. Current racial disparities related to felon disenfranchisement, and they are stark. And it's because of the cumulative impact of the racially disparate treatment and impact that Blacks face at various points on the criminal justice continuum leads to this cumulative disparity that we see in felon disenfranchisement, because it's a direct collateral sanction of the felony conviction. African Americans represent 21% of the voting age population. They are 42% of the people that are disenfranchised in 84 of 100 counties. And we could only get data, census data, for 84 counties because the census doesn't report race data less than 1,000 people. I think it's some quirky thing like that. But in 84 counties where we were able to get good data, 84 of the 100 counties, the disenfranchisement rate is higher for Blacks than whites. In 24 counties, roughly a quarter of our states, is 4 times higher for Blacks than whites. And some notables include some of our so-called really progressive pockets, our metro areas, Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is, 7 times the rate Blacks to whites. Buncombe County, where Asheville is, where all the people go in the mountains, where the so-called white progressive are, 7 times the rate for Blacks compared to white. Wake County, where Raleigh, where the capital city is, 6 times the rate for Blacks compared to whites. Orange County, where Chapel Hill is, University of North Carolina, 8 times the rate for Blacks to whites. Black men, 9% of the voting age population, 36% of those who are disenfranchised. Remember, to neuter the purposes of the 15th Amendment. Counsel also identified 16 elections where the outcome could have been different if 13-1 didn't disenfranchise people in those counties, because the number of people who were disenfranchised grossly outweighed the electoral difference between the winning and the losing candidate. But we also had huge wealth-based disparities related to 13-1, because remember, you do not get the unconditional discharge from probation until you pay all the money. And so our expert witness found that you have to pay all the money to be able to ensure that you get your voting rights back. In North Carolina, people with felony convictions must pay court costs, fine, or any restitution. This is statutorily. They must pay the cost of their appointed counsel, public defender, anyone who represented them in their probation. They must pay a monthly supervision fee. Failure to pay results in a mandatory late fee and potential revocation or termination or extension of your probation. Over the last 2 decades, our General Assembly has increased costs by over 400%. And these costs vary in any number of ways. And this is Amici put into the record that this has been a trend since 1986 to shift these taxpayer costs to the people who are going through that user-based system. We found that everyone on community supervision owes money. both the 40,000 people who are on probation as well as the people who are on post-release supervision. In addition, 90% of the people who are on probation at 40,000 owe other legal financial obligations. So for example, if you're on felony probation in North Carolina, the median amount owed in court costs is $573. The median amount owed in other fees is $340. The median amount owed in restitution is $1,400. The total median amount owed if you're on probation is over $2,400, $2,441. Post-release supervision, the numbers are equally as daunting. Court costs, median amount owed $839. Median amount owed in other fees, $40. Median amount owed in restitution, $1,500. Total median amount owed, $521. Of the people, the 44,000 people, expert witness also put this in the record, who've had failure to comply, that mean they've been issued failure to pay orders, show us cause, why you have not paid. 44,000 people have been identified as having had failure to pays issued. 49% of those are Black folks. So the ability to pay is not evenly spread either. So you have disproportionality on who's ensnared in the criminal justice system. You have disproportionality in who's given debt. And then you have disproportionality in who has the ability to pay that debt back. We put all of that into the record. We also showed that judges are not waiving debt. In fact, the last year, where in 2018, judges statutorily have the ability to waive or revoke these costs. We showed that we put evidence into the record that they're not doing that. In 2018, there were about 29,000 cases where debt was waived or partially waived. It wasn't waived in 850,000 cases. So we know that they aren't waiving debt, and it's having a huge impact. Our expert witness, Dr. Traci Burch, showed that it can have huge electoral impacts. In fact, she submitted evidence that 38.5% of the people currently under supervision had registered to vote in the past. We know if you enfranchise these people and give them their rights, they will use them. We put evidence into the record to show that. Statistical evidence, unrebutted evidence, that makes it a fact in the law, right? She also found that disenfranchisement of the community supervised population could affect the General Assembly elections. In fact, in one district, Senate District 9, the number of previously registered voters among the population under community supervision in that district is more than double the vote margin in 2018 in the contest for that seat. Also submitted evidence that out of the 52,000 people currently under some form of community supervision, 38.5% or 20,362 were matched to the voter file as having registered to vote at some point prior to their conviction. Give people their rights, they will exercise them. Finally, she submitted evidence into the record that at least 5 federal and state legislative contests from 2018 in which the number of people under community supervision were previously registered in that district is greater than 25% of the vote margin between the winner and losing challenger. And so in sum, we put all of this evidence into the record that 13-1 is unconstitutional because it violates our free and fair elections clause. Elections certainly aren't free in North Carolina. You got to pay to be able to register, right? And they certainly aren't fair. It violates our equal protections clause because of its racist intent and continued racist outcomes. And it also violates the equal protection clause because it creates an impermissible wealth-based classification by requiring you to have to pay off all of your LFOs to get that unconditional discharge. Lastly, it also violates our ban on property qualifications because you essentially have to own a certain amount of money, i.e. property, as a precondition to vote. All of this was extremely affirming to put into the record because, see, I'm one of those people. In 1996, I was convicted of a first-time nonviolent drug crime. I was given 10 years in prison. I served a mandatory 40 months on that 10 years. I went into prison with a high school diploma. I came out with a high school diploma. Fortunate enough for me, I had a loving family that could provide me food, clothing, and shelter. And I could think, I could make a plan. I went back to school and got my associate's degree, bachelor's degree, law degree. I'm licensed to practice law in Minnesota and North Carolina. I've built a practice area exclusively devoted to the restoration of the civil and human rights of people who've been to prison and jail. I worked in the Obama administration, but despite all of those accolades, I can't vote right now if I was to move back to the state of Alabama because I still owe them $32,000. I've been paying 192 months. Every month I gotta pay. If I don't pay, they can issue a warrant for my arrest. So these issues are not esoteric. It ain't fuzzy for me. I go hard on this stuff because these terrible things happen to me and I'm continue to be impacted by them.
Thanks, Daryl. Great. Thanks so much for those comments. I learned a lot. Okay, we will move on to our final speaker. Ghandi is a senior counsel with the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Ami works on reducing barriers to voting and civic participation among underserved communities. She also worked previously as the executive director of South Asian Policy, the South Asian Policy and Research Institute, where she led initiatives on voting rights, immigrant rights, among other civil protections. So today, Amy brings expertise on local initiatives for racial justice at local and state levels, especially in Chicago. Thanks so much for joining us today, Amy.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you all. Arturo, Daryl, Professor Burch, thank you so much for being able to learn from your insights today. I apologize in advance. I hope you all don't end up hearing my small children running around, but that might happen. I am a senior counsel for voting rights at Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, a nonpartisan group of advocates focused on racial equity and economic opportunity. Our organization has been doing this work for the past 50 years in Chicago. And we conduct nonpartisan voter protection work in Chicago and Illinois, expanding to Indiana in recent days as well, per the request of community members there. And my work is focused on lowering barriers to the ballot for voters and addressing the persistent racial gaps in our voting system. For example, in Illinois, even though we're ahead of the curve in many aspects of voter access, we unfortunately still have very significant racial disparities when it comes to voter registration access. And voters of color, particularly Black citizens, Latino citizens, and Asian American citizens, lag behind in registration and participation rates as compared to white citizen counterparts. We also know from research that voters living in entirely Black census block groups or geographies on average must wait longer at the polls than voters living in census block groups with no Black residents. That's even in the year 2020, those kinds of differences remain. So the first question that we ask as civil rights advocates is, why do racial gaps persist in our voting system? The fact is that our election system from the very beginning were set up for only particular people to be able to preserve their power, in particular white landowning men. And despite incredible victories in access won by advocates over the years, the remnants of that racist system still persist with us. So even when we look at voter registration systems themselves, something that many of us accept as just one of those annoying bureaucratic things that we and our communities have to deal with when it comes to be election time, those systems themselves were set up both in Illinois and across the country specifically to limit who was allowed to vote, specifically to try to reduce the electorate so that people in power could hang on to that power, and specifically to exclude Black community members who were formerly enslaved, immigrant citizens, and also low income and low wealth community members, not to mention additional groups as well. And so, when we have conversations about the specific laws and procedures of our election system with election officials and government leaders in Illinois and elsewhere, sometimes it's really hard to get to a place with those decision makers and policymakers where we can get them comfortable to talk about race, because they may look at a system that that's been churning along for decades or longer, that they've just been making small little tweaks to over time to be more fair-minded in their point of view, but they may not realize the historical damage that's been caused to communities, particularly communities of color and particularly the Black community, of just the whole underpinnings of that kind of system in the first place. These remnants of these racist systems persist even now, even in Illinois, even showing up during our most recent primary election, which was in March over here. And we saw a number of challenges that community members faced in spite of all of the challenges with the unprecedented primary election. It was on March 17th in Illinois, and you may remember that was just when life was starting to change for a lot of us with the stay-at-home orders given by our public health authorities. Even in those conditions, many community members across the state were determined to exercise their right to vote. And through our voter protection work, where we assist voters over the phone and in person, we were able to lead to help many voters to take things into their own hands and to advocate for themselves so that they could gain entry to the polls. I'm going to put in the chat here, I'm sorry, I'm multitasking a little bit because I want to share this link with you, to put in the chat a summary of some of the voting conditions that we saw in Illinois during the primary election. One of the stories I'd like to share with you is when an eligible voter called us on our 866 Our Vote election protection hotline, and he had done his homework. He knew he was eligible to vote. He was on pretrial electronic monitoring. So a lot of people around him were confused about whether he was allowed to vote or not. He was not confused. He knew, he had researched it. He knew he had the right to vote. And he contacted the authorities to allow him enough time, even with the electronic monitoring limitations he was facing. He should have been given enough time to make it feasible for him to vote, but the government authorities did not understand the logistics of what he had to tackle to get to his assigned polling place in time, especially in pandemic circumstances. We worked with him to advocate to the Cook County Department of Corrections, the Cook County Sheriff's Office, and the Cook County Clerk's Office to give him extra time. And eventually, through his diligent efforts, he was able to cast a ballot. It's nonsensical, though, that he should have to go through all those steps, even when, again, he had done his homework, he had done his research, he was trying to follow all the complicated rules and exercise his right to vote. So we found it just to be absolutely appalling that he had to go through all those hoops in order to exercise his right to vote. We know that racial disparities in voting rights become particularly glaring when we look at our system of mass incarceration, as the other speakers have really artfully set forth already. We know through historic and modern day examples that the mass incarceration system just worsens the inequities in our voting system. And you've heard a lovely summary of the history of laws that helped reinforce these wrong ideas, but these very persistent ideas of Black inferiority and criminality that still infuse our government decision makers to this day, sometimes whether they realize it or not, or whether they acknowledge it or not. You know, I hear from local and state election officials who kind of think of themselves as post-racial, or they think they'll start quoting Michelle Alexander to me and just say, you know, how dare could you think that I'm doing anything wrong? I'm not trying to hurt anyone. And so we really, as advocates, try to work past that and talking about how can we make our systems more equitable and make it less about finger pointing or about name calling, but really still try to keep the focus on race when it needs to be there in order for us to get beyond the inequities. We can't underestimate how much this backdrop and context affects current barriers to voting. So these historic and current laws that disenfranchise community members in the criminal legal system, it can cause a lot of misinformation and confusion about voter eligibility, unfortunately. And so the next question that we get to as civil rights advocates is when we're trying to think about, okay, why is the system the way it is? And next, what can we do about the impact of mass incarceration on voting rights? Our organization believes that if we want to really do what we say we want to do to protect the fundamental right to vote, we have to listen to those communities' most directly impacted by these issues. You know, I simply cannot put it better than Daryl put it when he graciously shared his story and explained that community members affected by these issues that we talk about and have speaking engagements about and webinars about, I mean, they have to be the moral center of our movements and the main sources of our information for this work. For those people, like at least myself, I'll just speak for myself. If I'm a step removed, what am I doing in my everyday legal practice or nonprofit work? What is my organization doing? And every single person I'm working with are pro bono volunteers who live a life that's pretty different than mine, and they live a life that's pretty different from incarcerated community members. What are we doing to make sure that we're centering the input from community members most directly affected? I'm not suggesting we have that all perfected or that we have it all completely figured out. It's a work in progress. It has definitely become more difficult in COVID times to get input directly from community members. We will not give up at all, but it's been hard, to be honest with you. We, for the last few years, Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and myself in particular have had the extreme honor to work with community members in Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, students who have been part of DePaul University's Inside Out program led by Professor Christina Rivers, and then who through their own initiative said, okay, we completed this class, this Inside Out class. We still have a lot more work to do when it comes to advancing voting rights and our scholarship. And they formed the Law, Politics, and Civic Engagement think tank of Stateville Prison, which has done phenomenal work and scholarship on a variety of areas relating to voting rights and civic engagement. When I first joined the think tank as a participant, it was about 3 years ago. I thought of it like this kind of speaking engagement where I'm going to be talking maybe to some students in the audience. And I thought of it kind of like a guest lecture. And a young colleague of mine sat me down because she had a lot of experience in that setting with that think tank. And she said, that's not really what it's going to be like. It's an exchange. It's not like you're just there to train them on something or teach them something. Sure, maybe they'll have some legal or policy questions for you. That's why they invited you to come. But it's an exchange. They've been doing a lot of scholarship on this in their own right, and it's pretty sophisticated. So my colleague kind of giving me a reality check, and also once I went there and started to participate regularly in that think tank, I quickly felt very humbled and realized, you know, how true that was, that people incarcerated and returning community members have spent a lot of time thinking through the interconnections of this, and have done a lot of sophisticated groundwork to think about not just the problems, but where do we go from here? Incarcerated and returning community members we work with are among the most civically engaged that we have seen anywhere. I'm just telling you that from the anecdotal experience and also what we learned from their insights. We've seen a high level of civic engagement, like other speakers talked about, taking a variety of forms. Some of them are not eligible to vote, but civic engagement in a lot of different forms among those with a felony conviction, both currently and formerly incarcerated, as well as among those in pretrial detention who are eligible to vote. And we've seen the civic engagement through our in-person work in places like the jail and the prison, and also through our voter protection hotline that I mentioned to you, 866 Our Vote. There are some very serious barriers that community members have, even to accessing the phone or much less internet or other things. So I'm not saying it's going to solve everyone's issues that we have this voter protection hotline, but we do get some community inquiries and questions that way. And sometimes people have their friends and family member call us as well if they are not able to access the phone themselves. One of our incarcerated colleagues said the following, which I wanted to share with you. This was relating to one of the policy initiatives that we have worked on together for the last few years. He said, many with felony convictions have a low morale because of the stigma that they are faced with on a daily basis. As someone myself convicted of a felony, I've learned that being civically engaged is empowering because it gives one a sense of being connected to their community as well as to society as a whole. Many are not aware that their voices still matter in the process of democracy. So you've heard me share about how these colleagues have informed a lot of our advocacy, And that includes the passage of a law last year that's now in the early stages of implementation in Illinois, which is called the Civics in Prison Law, or it was in the legislative process, it was called HB 2541. And it requires in-person peer-led civics education to Illinois citizens who are leaving state prison and who are preparing for the reentry process. So I'm going to put another link here in case you're interested in more information about that, or Arturo or others, feel free to share my contact information if anyone would like to hear more about this. But this is a law that community members in Stateville Prison helped write and pass. And the need for that program became clear when the Stateville community members' own social science research in partnership with DePaul, Professor Christina Rivers at DePaul, showed that the overwhelming majority of community members in that prison did not know that they had the right to vote after they completed their sentence, and did not know procedurally how to exercise that right to vote, but the majority were interested in voting if they could. So again, this law is in the early stages of implementation. Happy to answer any questions about that as best as I can. And another place where community members' input must be heard is in Cook County Jail, where the majority of community members in that correctional institution are being detained pre-trial, have not been convicted of anything, are awaiting a trial. And the reason that most community members are there is because of financial inability to pay bail. And that's still, unfortunately, the system in Illinois and many places in the country. They fully have the legal right to vote on paper, but in a practical sense, have a very difficult time exercising that right to vote because they are in jail. And in 2019, Illinois lawmakers passed a law that made Cook County Jail the first jail in the country to be an official in-person polling location. And the first time that that law was implemented was during the March 2020 Illinois primary election that you heard me talk a bit about. Over the last few years, even before this formal polling place started in Cook County Jail, our legal team has conducted nonpartisan poll watching in the jail alongside activists from Chicago Votes, League of Women Voters of Chicago, and others to ensure that these eligible voters can actually, in a practical sense, access the ballot. And now that COVID-19 is in the picture, a lot of the voter access is, there's a big threat of the voter access being scaled back, especially in places like Cook County Jail that have such dire public health emergency situations that are facing community members there every day in these times. And with the November election less than 70 days away, it's very likely that restrictions to voting are going to continue to be a problem for community members in jail and in other circumstances as well. And we're very concerned that that disenfranchisement will land most sharply on Black and Brown community members who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, by mass incarceration and voting challenges, all of that layered on top of each other. I am sharing one more link with you, which is about some of the observations from our last round of jail voter protection. Again, really trying to center the experiences of voters who we talk to there in that environment. And for anyone who would like to get involved at the local level in Chicago or Illinois and in fighting against this kind of disenfranchisement, we ask you to consider getting involved with our organization or with other organizations who are trying to make a difference locally. You can help us get the word out about our hotline, 866-OUR-VOTE, volunteer with our nonpartisan election protection program. And thank you also for even attending this conversation and being a part of this discussion today. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Ally. And thanks for linking all of those really helpful resources. And we'll send those out again after the talk so that everybody can have them post Zoom meeting. Great, so now we'll move on to the Q&A session. So for everybody, as a reminder, feel free to keep sending your questions to Alicia Nunez. You can see her comments in the chat. You can click her name and it'll send a direct message. So type your questions and we're creating a queue here. I'll be reading the questions to our speakers. Okay, so the first question I believe is for any of the three panelists. It says, in Florida, we voted to restore voting rights to incarcerated persons. However, the state legislator mandated that formerly incarcerated people must pay back any outstanding court or legal system fees before regaining their right to vote. How prevalent are these financial challenges for previously incarcerated persons? And I think it doesn't say, I mean, Traci, this is kind of, well, actually, this is perfect for all of you. So whoever wants to go first.
Since I'm on the spot, I actually don't know the answer to that in terms of all states. And it's funny, I came across the data recently, and I can't tell you exactly which states require payment of obligations, but it's a subset of the 18 that I said that it's all felony convictions. So in terms of that, whether then you have to satisfy in order to fully complete all felony convictions plus the 12 we have some post release. I'm not sure other than Florida and North Carolina which one of those require that, but someone else may.
I think this issue is a great question. We don't have a good national, like, one snapshot to say this is where every state falls in their legal financial obligation regime. I know in our case, for our case, we looked at some other surrounding states, because one part of our statute requires you, if you're someone out of state, to get an unconditional discharge from the agency that has supervision over you. So if you have a Kentucky felony and you're under supervision in Kentucky, you have to get an unconditional discharge from Kentucky to be able to vote in North Carolina, unless you had your probation transferred to North Carolina, and then you would need to get that unconditional discharge from our community corrections. But we don't have a good one-shot place to go look at what's the national scope of that. I think Fees and Fines Justice Center is trying to do some of that nationally, but you know, each criminal legal system is his own little fiefdom, right? That creates his own little rules, and so it's so state specific. But I think this will become more of an area of prominence that people are going to be given 50 state surveys, because the access to the franchise and so many other rights and benefits are attached to paying off legal financial obligations.
Great, thanks. So I'll go on to the next question. This one is for Daryl specifically. It says, Daryl, thanks for bringing both a personal and organizational perspective to the panel today. How do you or Forward Justice approach connecting personal stories with the broader problem of mass incarceration? Do people react differently when facing the lived experiences of these problems?
Yeah, I think if you do it strategically, if you do it in a way that is not like an individualized narrative that can be exceptionalized or, you know, dismissed as, oh, that's one person. But if you're doing it as reflective of a group of people, right, reflective of entire communities, I think it's incredibly powerful. I think it's the only way that, in fact, I think it's one of the only things that moves people. You know, so it's this branch of science, and that some may know a lot more than me, that I've been exposed to, social cognition theory, right? Where because we come in contact with so much data, we have to develop shortcuts, right? To be able to think. We don't want to think every time like, oh, every time you have to sit down, this is a chair with legs, right? So we come up with these shortcuts. And even people who they've done all kind of testing, even people who want to be progressive, because of their preconceived already schemas, that if you lead with data, you are not going to move those folks facts don't matter at the end of the day. Facts matter. You got to come, and I know as a scientist, Traci is probably like, don't say that, but I know, but the facts come after you connect to a value system. You have to hit people emotionally first. There was a reason that Dr. King's speech was not, I have a complaint, but I have a dream. You have to tap into people's aspirational value system. But when you read that speech, you see nothing but a litany of complaints, but it's fed into people's aspirational vision because people want to connect to that emotionally, right? If he would have led with the complaints, they would have shut down. So I think personal stories can be very transformative if you use them strategically in that way to be illustrative of, as a larger group and as a way to connect on values that opens up, you know, what the brain science shows us, people's portals to be able to hear ideas different.
Thanks, Daryl. The next question is for Ami. It says, could you tell us more about the Civics in Prison bill? How was the bill received by state legislators? Was there any resistance to providing civic education to incarcerated citizens?
Thank you for the question. There was some resistance before we got to the point where there was bipartisan and almost unanimous support for this. It was slow going to get to that point. And we first received resistance from those state leaders and agencies who would have to put in the work to implement this in terms of the correctional staff time. And I mean, it's a peer-led program, so there's lots of rationales that I could give, and I tried to give about how this should not be unduly costly, but still there are going to be some expenses with what they call the movements in the prison to transport people and to allow them to be in what the correctional system looks at as a secure environment to conduct this peer education. So yeah, there was initially opposition from the government agencies who would have some increased staffing or some changes to their status quo on their plate because of this. And we didn't get their complete enthusiastic, yes, we want to see this law passed, but we were able to, as one of the legislative sponsors put it to us, we neutralized the opposition at some point in the legislative process, which was good enough, I mean, as far as we were concerned. And we were able to, through Professor Christina Rivers, through the stories of that incarcerated community members generously shared in their testimony, we were able to answer the questions and the doubts that the correctional agencies had. I think even just showing up in those settings, if you don't mind, I'm gonna go on a tangent for a minute. I showed up at one of the hearings where I thought this was gonna be a pretty contentious debate about the passage of this law through that particular committee. And I had a really thick legal testimony. I wasn't gonna read the whole thing, but I was gonna condense some of the main points. And the hearing, it was getting late in the evening. The legislators, I could see they were like looking at their watches and getting tired, and they had other, what they thought of as more urgent public safety stuff on their agenda. They thought this is like maybe a frivolous sounding program and not really as public safety oriented as what they had in mind. So I saw one of the, who had previously said he was an opponent of this. He and a staff member were thumbing through the thick testimony, that the written testimony we had submitted, and then they decided to drop their opposition so that I wouldn't go up there and speak. And so it was a little bit embarrassing because they just thought, oh, this person's going to be really long-winded and we're tired and we have other stuff on our agenda. So that's what neutralized the opposition in that particular hearing. It was not the best experience in civic engagement that I was, all excited to come and testify and share our incarcerated colleague stories, and I couldn't, but the objective got achieved through a funny and like a little bit insulting way, but the objective was achieved, so it's all right. So those are some of the things we learned about the legislative advocacy process, but in the end there was bipartisan and almost unanimous support, which we were really grateful for.
Thanks, Ami. Great, so we'll do the next question now. This one is for Traci. It says, what can political scientists do, or what do they do to address some of these problems from an academic perspective? How do students, for example, respond to learning about mass incarceration and voter suppression? Is advocacy a part of political science research? I'm wondering how academic advocacy and legal work intersect.
Wow, that's a big question. And I guess, do you know who asked the question? I don't want you to say the name, but is it a political scientist?
I'm not sure.
Okay, because I was going to say
Yeah.
I could tailor my answer specifically, but I think what is interesting is that everybody kind of has to find their own way. And I do think that if you are an academic, there is a push not to do real world work from your colleagues. So especially in political science, like sociology or some other disciplines may be different. But when I started doing the work that I did, political scientists didn't really do work on the criminal justice system at all. And when I was doing work, like we did a lot of work, me and my advisors in graduate school talking about things like, well, how do you explain to people what it is that you do? And like how, like you have to answer questions like, why aren't you a lawyer? And shouldn't you be in law school? And all these other questions. So it's not, you have to kind of make space for yourself to do that work. And then the world sometimes changes around you to where you are working on something and everybody else is like, hey, this is really important and interesting. How do we not know about this? So it is, so it can be, as a political scientist, difficult to get people to see something that is important that seems obvious. And that's because, you know, most disciplines get wrapped up in things that they think are important, especially since political science is not about politics, which is a surprise to many, but it's true. So how do I communicate what I do to students and how do I get involved? So part of the fact that you see I don't really fit is why I have two jobs. So I'm only half-time at Northwestern as a political science professor, and the other half, I'm a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. And so I spend my time there, like talking to legal communities and doing work that's interesting to people who practice law. Even though it's the same work, like I actually spend time translating my work to people who practice law and giving talks before, like, you know, a breakfast of state Supreme Court judges and stuff. So it's you know, sometimes even in that world, I don't necessarily fit. Like I don't know if I'll, yeah, I've said some, I have been to some of these places and said some pretty unpopular things. Like that time I gave a talk before the National Black Judges Association and told them Hillary Clinton was going to lose in 2016. They didn't like that. But I think that it's sometimes it's professionally risky as a political scientist to do the kind of work that I do, but it's also, if you do a good job at it, it can be rewarding. It's high risk, high reward. I'll put it that way. The second thing I'll say is with respect to students, I think students have a very different perspective, and they're at Northwestern to understand the world, right? So if they see something in the world, they tend to gravitate toward professors who have something to say about it, as opposed to the ones who are up in the clouds and have like kind of useless information. So if I can, and I actually keep a lot of like the work that I've been doing lately on like the expert testimony stuff. I haven't really talked about it to my students, but it's one of those things where they want to know more about the world that's going on. So this fall I taught online, and I taught law in the political arena, and I taught race and public policy. And so, you know, and every time I teach those courses, I'm dealing with, like, I have to cover impeachment. I have to give them a space to talk about COVID. I have to give them a space to talk about George Floyd. And we, you know, and it's already built into my lesson plan that we're going to learn about, you know, the 1960s. And it's a logical extension to say, well, how is that time different? How is it the same? So I think that people who tend to take my courses are already interested. in certain kinds in things that are going on. And by the time I've given them the baseline stuff, and they just go to sections and they want to talk. So it hasn't been hard to get people engaged. What I do struggle with is finding a way to talk about these issues in ways that don't like lead the students. So I just want to give them the tools to do the work for themselves. And most of the time they're interested in they care and they want to know more. So yeah, I find I can't even tell them enough.
Arturo, could I just kind of piggyback that a little bit? I forgot, someone gave me a vegetarian kind of way to say that instead of piggyback. So excuse my meat reference, but I can't remember it right now. But I don't, Dr. Burch is being incredibly modest as a litigator, and and someone who tries to be a student of history. I've come to appreciate the counter narrative that experts like herself, through the evidence that they're able to produce, and we aren't in any way shaping that. They're going where they're scientists, they're going where the data tells them, but we have hunches. The counter narrative that provides to the opposing experts, and for you all, you probably don't know this, but it's like 5 or 6 white men who are going around testifying all around the country in service of white supremacy. I'm just going to call it what it is, right? And it reminds me historically how important real scientists were to rebut junk science back in the day that was used to buttress and support white supremacy, right? So your work is critically important, right, to be able to use in that way, because it gives us the ammunition that we need to knock down junk science that they're going around testifying around to support these white supremacist laws. Dr. Burch, maybe I ain't supposed to talk about your work, but you testified. I mean, you've submitted work in Florida. That was one of the most important civil rights cases in the country. She submitted work in our case. That's going to be one of the most important civil rights cases in the country, on the cutting edge of making sure that junk science does not get any foothold in maintaining these white supremacist laws.
Thanks, Daryl. And
I was
Traci.
just going to say, wow,
go
thank
ahead.
you.
Yeah, no, I mean,
High
Traci's
praise.
work is amazing. I agree with Daryl. Well, this is a perfect transition to the next question, which I think is for all three of you, or whoever wants to come in. So this one says, what is the history of using felony records as an excuse for voter disenfranchisement? Is this something specific to the U.S. carceral state, or more broadly a shared practice among highly carceral states?
Can the answer be yes to both? I mean, so look, civil death or civic death is a vestige of European common law. But the particular way that Southern states particularly used felon disenfranchisement was in a way that was highly racialized, right? Because they were doing it in a particular way to make sure certain people were divested of political power. Prior to slavery, when it didn't, prior to the remix of slavery, I don't call it the end, prior to the passage of the 13th Amendment, there was no reason to worry about disenfranchising Black folks. We were slaves, right? So you didn't have to worry about felon disenfranchisement. And so the particular way that Southern states used it post-Reconstruction is highly racialized and has a particular story that goes with it.
Yeah, I think it's critical to remember that connection and also to question everything. So even when we hear so-called rationales about what is the connection? Why should someone not be able to vote when they are serving a sentence in connection with the criminal conviction, both for the historic rationales around that and for the modern repercussions. I would just encourage everyone to, question those assumptions because they don't really make sense. It was not done for necessarily a sound policy reason. And there are so many things in our voting system that are done for political reasons and to preserve political power. And then the rationale is an afterthought. Okay, how do we explain it so that it's more palatable and it doesn't sound as bad as I was just trying to fend off a political challenge.
And it isn't dispositive of anything, but it does tell us something. The two states that have no restrictions on people's ability to vote, whether you're outside or while you're incarcerated, Maine and Vermont, demographically are two of the whitest states in the country. So what is that telling us, right? That these folks didn't feel that it should be any restrictions on the franchise, and they inherited that same European common law. What's that about, right? We should want to ask that question.
One of the most interesting stories I researched for my dissertation a long time ago, but it was recent back then, was so I was in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts used to be one of those states that had no restrictions. And the story of how they came by having restrictions is super disturbing and super interesting. And what happened was a group of people in a prison decided to organize. And I can't remember the name of the group, but they were trying to organize for rights and conditions, and they started a PAC and started making campaign donations to different politicians. And so no one, I think if anyone even accepted the donations, they then returned them. But then they basically cracked down on organizing within the institutions and passed a disenfranchisement law because of this attempt by this express attempt by a group of people to get involved in the political system from prison. And so they were just like, oh no, that's a bridge too far. And that was like 1998. So it wasn't, so even thinking about what that means in terms of overturning almost 300 years of tradition in Massachusetts, to think about what this one cracking down on this one group meant. It's just a really, it says a lot about what these laws are for. And again, I don't think that they would have, it's a small enough group where they could have, I don't think it were an electoral threat or anything like that. It's just the idea of this group having any kind of political influence or a voice was just too much for the legislature. And so they said it. They basically stripped away a lot of their organizing rights, including the vote.
Thanks, everyone. The next question actually draws on some of these geographic points that you're all making. So this one says, how do the North and South of the United States compare on mass incarceration and voter suppression? Is the strategy for primarily advocating in the South used because the North of the country is somehow better on these issues?
I'll begin. I mean, better is a relative word. That's in, look, I'm going to channel my social scientists over here. That's hard to measure. I guess what I would say, we do know some things from the data, right? And what the data would tell you is that when you look at the top 5 leading incarcerators on the planet, 4 of those 5 are southern states. When you look at post-Shelby, there was this big Supreme Court case, Shelby County versus Alabama. And in that case, the Supreme Court gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which required certain states, if they made any changes to their electoral process, they had to pre-clear it with the U.S. Department of Justice prior to making that change. once pre-clearance was struck down, 11 out of 13 southern states passed voter suppression type laws immediately after Shelby. So, I mean, you can draw your own conclusions from that, but that's what the data says with regards to both incarceration and voter suppression, and that's 2 points.
I'd like to add, and I definitely want the tip from you about a vegetarian-friendly way to not say piggyback, but I want to add that, you know, doing voting rights work primarily in Chicago and Illinois, we definitely want to acknowledge that this is not the most dire environment for restrictions on voting in Chicago and Illinois compared to the atrocities that we read about and hear about from colleagues and community members in other parts of the country. So it's tricky for us at times, and people ask us, and they should ask us, why are you so focused on Chicago and Illinois? Isn't there worse stuff going on elsewhere? So we're always definitely open to hearing people out about that. You know, we are Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and our work is locally focused because we try to be grounded in what communities locally ask us to prioritize in our legal work, but definitely don't want to suggest that the issues that we're talking about here are necessarily the same as what community members are facing in other parts of the country.
I don't know that it's, I think Daryl is right with the point of what better or worse means. You know, even if you do some math and add up the number of people who are affected, you know, I don't necessarily know that California has, even though they have a different law, I don't necessarily know that California has fewer total people who are disenfranchised than, say, a smaller state that has a worse regime, for instance, because California's prison population is so big. So, I think it's just really, it's a really hard question. It's really hard to quantify across the country what's better and what's worse. And sometimes it could be that a strategy is to start where you can more easily make a difference and build momentum, and then toward a more liberal policy in terms of voting. So other states may feel pressure, or you may be able to build more of a national campaign if you start in places where you can get some victories early.
Great, thanks everyone. Okay, so we have a final question, and also a really timely one, so probably a good one to close out our roundtable for today with. So this is for all panelists. It says, Ami mentioned that new issues related to COVID are presenting themselves in jails. These are, of course, now intersecting with voter suppression from the Trump administration. Can you talk more about how these are affecting voting conditions in jails? How are incarcerated voters affected by these factors on top of their already constrained opportunities?
I'll be happy to start. We are very concerned about going backward in terms of voter access for the November election compared to March when it comes to the strides that and the hard-fought rights that community members had gained in terms of in-person voter access in Cook County Jail in particular. And what I'm trying to word my answer carefully. I think anyone who has a question about what rights election authorities or correctional institutions are willing to dispose of with using COVID as an excuse should ask the government authorities that. And that's what we've been doing. And we're still awaiting answers, and we like to work with them as collaboratively as possible. I can't use my poll watcher credential to go in there if I don't work with them collaboratively. So I have every interest to try to work with them collaboratively. But I think anyone, whether it's journalists or students or anyone in our communities who has questions, please join us in posing those questions to the election authorities who, we're still awaiting more answers about what they will allow. Now, I don't want to trivialize the health risk for voters because it could be complicated. I don't know how voters feel about the health risks inadvertently posed by a bunch of election personnel and poll watchers coming in. So I think what you asked, your last question, Arturo, about what do voters think about this has also been something that we've been really pushing on the election authorities, that do not slash any kind of access without very thoroughly talking to voters about what they want to see for November. And for us, it's been really hard with the different lockdowns and restrictions. We can't do our regular kind of community engagement and discussion since March. We have not been able to do it to the same degree. So I fully admit that I'm not in a moment where I feel like I know as much about the voter perspective, and really looking to learn more.
So I have to be careful here too about what I say because I'm involved in a couple of cases about COVID. So what I will say is that these states are struggling to allow all of us to vote. And there will probably be some issues in terms of even with getting out the mail-in ballots and everything to every household, as well as the issues with making sure that people with COVID can vote and people can vote from hospitals and everything else. And so we're pushing to make sure that everyone can vote safely. And I'm not even sure if a lot of these states are at the point where they can think about incarcerated individuals yet, when they're still fighting about trying to figure out where their polling locations are going to be and if there's going to be in-person voting at all, and fighting over whether there's going to be in-person voting at all. Like, I just heard a story about even if you set a polling place, for instance, that they use a lot of places like apartment buildings or churches and things like that. There was an outbreak at a church, and so they had to close the polling location immediately. And so then, what do you do with all those voters? Or when voters, there are some documented examples of poll workers and other people testing positive in the days after they had been in a polling location, and then you have to notify like 500 voters that they may have been exposed. So they are just struggling to figure out how to put this election on in many places at all, especially since they think it might be high turnout. And so I don't think a lot of places even have gotten the bandwidth to think about what to do about how this then intersects with any institutionalized populations. Again, thinking about nursing homes, hospitals, and college campuses, and not just people who are out on the street. So it's a real problem. I don't have anything better to add than that.
Great. Well, that's a good and realistic point to end on, I think, too, Traci. Thanks so much, everybody. This concludes our roundtable for today. Thanks again, Ami, Daryl, and Traci for joining us. This was a wonderful conversation. For everybody in the audience, this will be uploaded to the NPEP YouTube channel, so keep an eye out for that. And keep an eye out for our fall roundtable events. We will begin promoting those soon. We are organizing and finalizing those at the moment. Great. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Good to see everyone. Take care.